Now, our next story about what just happened in Australia is important for the whole world to understand, including America, because the reasons or justification for why it was done are being discussed in many countries. Let me explain. Australia has just passed a hate speech law that has sent a chilling effect across the nation. Many Australians are now reporting a fear of posting absolutely any opinions online because they could be put in prison for doing so. This bill is actually worse than what we saw in recent times in the UK. This anti-free speech bill was introduced under the guise of stopping, quote, anti-Semitism. It is important to note that Australia has experienced some alleged attacks on Jewish establishments and buildings, and I say alleged only because, and this is very important to note, to the best of our research, barely any perpetrators, despite millions of dollars to police task forces and grants to the Jewish community, have actually been identified. Many feel absolute clarity over motives and evidence have not been provided. What we have seen is a lot of conjecture from the media, politicians, and police. However, much of the evidence that has been reported has left a lot to be desired. They claim they may be foreign influence groups contributing to this. Again, no sound evidence, but this could be attributed to ongoing investigations, of course. One pertinent example is from the 6th of December 2024. The Adass Israel Synagogue of Melbourne experienced a fire. With minimal investigation having taken place, the government almost immediately declared it a terrorist attack. 2 people were reportedly seen on camera. However, no terrorist has been found. To this day, by the way, as at the time of this recording, and we'll show you on Google that the investigation is still ongoing. No concrete evidence has been given to justify that this was a terrorist attack. But there was a strange interview that emerged with a reported attendee of the synagogue who reportedly called the police, ran away from them when they arrived at the scene. Very odd behaviour, given usually the person who calls the police is generally grateful to see them and eager to work with them, and had burn marks on his hands, which he said were a result of the police apparently letting him run into the burning building to retrieve his cell phone while it was on fire. The government immediately at the time used this as an opportunity to introduce the idea of sweeping speech laws, which they said were needed due to anti-Semitism and terrorism, regardless of the fact that investigations were still open and the Australian people were not given any evidence to support that their speech now needed to be restricted due to terrorism, where a terrorist has yet to be identified and have been provided no certainty as to why their freedoms must be infringed upon. Let me repeat, at that time, and now, to the best of our knowledge and research, no perpetrator caught, no charges laid, no court case, no conviction. Now, we're not saying these attacks were not anti-Semitic in nature, but that's because we don't know. And that is the exact point. We just don't know. The people need evidence of perpetrators, motives, plans, etc. And even if they were anti-Semitic, there are already laws in place to protect people from crimes of this nature. The reality is, these laws appear to be simply about restricting speech. So George Christensen, former politician, writes, "The war on free speech has begun. Some may say it's an absolute death blow to free speech. They did it in just a matter of days, without scrutiny, without real debate, and without a single care for the consequences. Australia's political establishment has rammed through the most dangerous anti-free speech law in our nation's history." He says, "Make no mistake, this is not about stopping terrorism. It's not about protecting people from violence. This is about silencing dissent, crushing conservative and Christian voices, and weaponizing the law against anyone who dares to challenge the establishment's agenda." The summary says the Australian government swiftly passed a controversial hate speech law, ignoring warnings from legal and religious groups. By the way, it was done with no debate and received assent within one day. This is unheard of, how quickly it was implemented. The law shifts from requiring intent to incite violence to merely being quote-unquote reckless, raising concerns over its potential misuse. Christian schools fear religious teachings could be criminalised, while critics argue the law will silence conservative voices. The bill was backed by both major parties, with conservatives accused of enabling its harsh provisions, and free speech advocates a warning of increasing authoritarianism and urge Australians to resist and push for the law's repeal. So, a particular Sky News commentator actually called out just how extreme the law is. Under the new legislation, a person can face jail time for simply being reckless with their words. Who defines reckless? No one really knows. Previously, incitement laws required intent. You had to actually mean to cause harm, but not anymore. The law has changed now from intentionally urges to merely advocates violence. And intent has been replaced with recklessness, meaning that you don't even have to mean it. You just have to be careless enough that someone thinks it could, maybe potentially, somewhat, could be leading to violence. You could say something, perhaps jokingly, not meaning that it will happen, but if you're reckless to the fact that it could happen, you now have, by the law, incited violence. Senator Gerard Rennick, who we've had on this broadcast before, condemned the bill as a direct attack on free speech, warning that it threatens freedom of speech by allowing the government to censor or punish individuals for expressing opinions that might be deemed offensive. And he pointed out that such laws are always applied selectively, noting that instead of combating hate, these laws can be weaponized to silence dissent and suppress unpopular viewpoints, ultimately undermining democratic values and individual liberties. On the impact of Christian schools, Vanessa Cheng from the Australian Association of Christian Schools says there is a real risk that the broad definitions and expanded list of attributes could criminalise religious teachings on sex or gender, which could be considered hateful or harmful by some people. Consider that. Christian schools, going to prison, teachers, students, I don't know, how far does this spread? Christian Schools Australia raised similar concerns, saying CSA calls on the Parliament to consider the unintended consequences of this bill, specifically the possible criminalisation of religious speech, such as our biblical teachings on sex and gender within our schools. This should terrify anyone who values religious freedom. The LGBT agenda is now legally protected, and Christianity is specifically not. Former politician Craig Kelly points out that this is another Trojan horse to suppress free speech. And he's going to go into some arguments here, but just note that the penalty that they're talking about here for things including political opinions is imprisonment for 7 years. Now listen to how this works. Firstly, it lowers the bar from threatening to use violence to that of threatening to use force. Secondly, it includes special protections for groups distinguished by political opinions. And thirdly, it removes the good faith defense. So if you engage in commentary about matters of public interest in an honest attempt to point out what you believe are errors in government policy or to try and achieve democratic changes in law, that's no longer a lawful exception. No, in fact, it can land you in prison. And fourthly, it makes a jail sentence mandatory. So even in the most innocent of cases, where it's a mere technical breach of the law, the courts can't give you warning. They must sentence you to jail. He's given a very important example here. So if you now say something like, quote, "We must fight against the totalitarian aims of the Marxists that have infiltrated our bureaucracies and want to censor free speech, sell us out to the globalists and force Australians to undergo compulsory medical interventions," end quote. He says by saying "we must fight," it could easily be deemed as threatening force. And as Marxists are a group distinguished by political opinion, and because you could then argue that by allowing free speech threatens the peace, order and good government, exactly the argument they successfully used during COVID, he says I'd then be guilty of an offence under this act for engaging in hate speech, and the courts would be forced to jail me for 7 years. George Christensen in his article says, quote, "If you thought this was just about stopping terrorism, think again. Teal MP Allegra Spender backed the bill on the basis that we needed to criminalise banners that read, quote, 'destroy pedo freaks,' end quote. Yes, really. She argued that people who hold up signs opposing pedophiles should be punished under hate speech laws. What does that tell you? Who exactly are they trying to protect here? This is the same political class that calls conservatives extremists for defending traditional values, yet wants to make it illegal to call out pedophiles." That's from George there. Now, by the definition of this bill, the government could pretend that this very report, presenting you with mere facts, is hateful by God knows what definition. I suppose the one that seeks to protect pedophiles. Now, going back to what I said at the start of this segment, it is very important for people to understand the process of how tyrannical laws pass. An event happens, it shocks the country or the world, then you have people starting to ask questions about the event. The government says you can't ask questions, and furthermore, because you're asking questions, we're going to make asking questions illegal, and even better, we're going to remove your rights in the process, including your physical self from society. No dissent on any level will be tolerated. And somehow, someway, they always find a way to ensure Christians' rights are affected in the process. The Australian government and governments around the world, including the US, are adopting the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, or IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism. Within the IHRA's definition, claiming that Jews killed Jesus is an implied crime. Even though our holy book says this, the IHRA's definition seems to be weaving its way into every country. The reason why this story matters to every country is because every single government, including the US, is utilising this definition of anti-Semitism and looking to enact similar laws and punishments. We call on all political leaders to please take notice of what's at stake here in Australia, and when it comes to the US, what does all of this entail for the First Amendment? Presently, this story has received minimal attention in the US, and furthermore, X has censored a post on the matter. There was a very detailed post posted by Citizen Go on how Australia's hate speech laws are de facto censorship laws, and it was taken down by X. I can attest to the fact that there was nothing quote-unquote illegal in the post, and it was before the official passing of the law, and yet X censored it. Obviously, this is all very breaking, very new, very convoluted, and we will be bringing you more on this, but I'd love to leave people with this. Pay attention to the pattern of events that occurred in Australia to get such a heinous law passed. Scrutinise them in detail and leave no stone unturned, as events like this are what politicians, governments, and activist groups will always use to take the opportunity to crush your freedoms. The evidence is in Australia today. It is a new day in America and a new administration in Washington, D.C. There is a lot of excitement and optimism about the future, but the reality is there is a lot of work to do, especially when it comes to fixing our broken healthcare system. The truth is that the forces that are responsible for breaking our healthcare system aren't going to simply go away. The challenges our system faces won't disappear overnight. Now more than ever, you need to be prepared. That's where the Wellness Company comes in. Their doctors are medical professionals that you can trust, and their line of prescription medical kits are the gold standard when it comes to keeping you safe and healthy. Whether it is the medical emergency kit, the contagion kit, or the first aid kit, or the travel kit, these prescription kits contain an assortment of life-saving medications and guidebooks to assist in the proper use of these medications. From the flu to strep throat, from COVID to the bird flu, from a trip to the beach to a trip overseas, the Wellness Company has a prescription kit designed to keep you and your family safe. Make America healthy again starts at home. Do your part and protect the health of you and your family. Go to twc.health/blackout today and order. That's twc.health/blackout and use the promo code blackout to save 10%.